This morning we have the one and only, our very own Taylor Owen to talk about reliability and information and some of the technological issues going on in the current pandemic. And with that, I'll turn it over to Taylor and I will say goodbye.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to just make a few comments for the next 15 minutes or so, and then we can just have a broader conversation here. So the context for how I'm coming at this and watching things evolve right now is sort of three around the role that reliable information plays in a democracy. I've been very interested in this, particularly around elections, but I think now we're seeing it play out in a broader context. The second is the structural problem around disinformation and misinformation, and how the design of our infrastructure really affects the quality of information we receive in our society, particularly in the digital space. And third is around the broader issues around our changing role that technology plays in our society. So that's kind of the lens through which I'm looking at this. The big caveat is that, I mean, I've just been trying to process this information overload like everyone has been over the past couple of weeks. We're scaling up a bunch of monitoring work of information flows right now. And so we'll have more to say about that literally in a couple of weeks when initial results come back. But right now, this is just a few of the things I've been thinking about over the past couple of weeks, trying to manage this deluge. So a few points. The first is that on mis and disinformation. So as always, as there always has been, there is a ton of shitty content on the internet. And right now, some of it is particularly damaging. There's a lot of great content on the internet. The internet is amazing for all sorts of reasons, but there's also a lot of really horrible stuff. And that really horrible stuff is in this conversation around the pandemic right now. The WHO is calling it an infodemic. They define that as an overabundance of information, some accurate and some not, that makes it hard for people to find untrustworthy sources, or find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. We're being inundated with content, and the signals of reliability are being lost. That's the important variable here. I think right now, there's moments in a democratic society when that information reliability is particularly important. It always is, but there's moments where this is heightened. I would say an election is one of them. We all need to know similar things in order to make collective decisions about our lives in a democracy, right? And the point we do that is in an election. Right now is also one of them. We all need to know similar thing, which is how we are to behave at this particular moment. And we are getting different pieces of information from different sources without strong signals of reliability. And that I think is a problem. So when you look at the type of misinformation and disinformation that's circulating right now, we're seeing medical misinformation, so just bad science, a lot of fake cures, false cases, and evidence of cases is circulating widely. We're seeing ideologically driven false content. So a broad community of people who broadly distrust science. I would put the anti-vax community in this bucket, who kind of amazingly are seeing this as a moment of opportunity to push back against the vaccination campaigns that are hopefully to come, right? So that's just how deranged some of these communities are. I think it's worth keeping that in mind. As always, in the misinformation space, we're seeing a ton of profiteers. So these are generally people looking to drive traffic to sites. The thing that drives traffic is sensational content. Sensational content is also often false and misleading. And so we're seeing a ton of fake cures, wellness products, phishing scams, for example. So emails that are going out en masse to try and get people to open up their data. Another category would just be pure conspiracy theorists. We've seen a ton of content around the disease is a bioweapon, around that the disease was created in a lab, that it was planned by someone in power. You've probably all seen the Bill Gates conspiracy theory that's been going around. that it's being carried by a wide range of animals around the world. So you're seeing in moments like this, we see a lot of conspiracy theories, and that's clearly happening now. And a final category that's pretty important, I think, is harmful speech. We've seen this take a few forms in the past few weeks. I mean, one has just been a lot of racist content, particularly like we saw in the SARS pandemic. So a lot of racist content directed at Asians. But some of it is more pernicious, I would say. There's been neo-Nazi communities who are talking about actually spreading the virus to cause chaos and to kind of disrupt traditional power structures and institutions. We're seeing a lot of people talking about closing down immigration and using this as a tool for closing down immigration. So I think when we start thinking about what's the most harmful type of speech that is being given a voice right now in a moment, we need to look at some of these particularly pernicious forms of it. This is occurring across social platforms, probably most challenging in private groups. A lot of our digital conversation, as we know, is shifting from open platforms like Twitter and to a certain degree Facebook. It is now shifting in most of the world to groups on Facebook and private messaging groups like WhatsApp and WeChat. Those are very difficult for anyone from the outside to see, even for people in the companies to see, because some of it's encrypted. And I think what we are headed towards here, when we look at the misinformation space broadly, is not a crisis of individual bad actors and bad content that we can stop, which I'll talk about in a second, but rather is an epistemological problem. How do we all come to know what we know? And that is the framework which I would sort of urge thinking through this, particularly from a policy perspective, which I'll get to in a moment. Second point I would make is, as we know about mis and disinformation, it often flows from the top. And now is certainly a case of that. I would say the way the Chinese government treated information flows around the original outbreak is a clear case of that. They suppressed scientific views. They misinformed the international health community and other governments. And that there's no question that played a role in the spread of this virus. Now we are facing something a bit different, and one that is this almost singularly unique moment, which is that probably the most dangerous person in this right now is the President of the United States, who every day gets on a podium and spreads false information. And I think it's worth pausing on that for a moment and just recognize how idiosyncratic a moment that is and how terrifying a moment that is. This has led people in the past few days, Jay Rosen, who's a journalism professor, Margaret Sullivan, who writes a media column for the Washington Post, and many others, to say that the media should stop broadcasting Trump's press conferences because they are public health. They're causing challenges in public health. Like, that is just think about that for a second, right? That is a remarkable thing, that we're talking openly, and these conversations are happening within the main newsrooms in the United States of whether they should cover the President of the United States. So when we think about information flows and the reliability of information in our society, we are in a very particular moment right now, and that's worth pausing on. Third point I would make, platforms, Facebook, Google, and Twitter in particular, in the past couple of weeks, have taken much more responsibility for their content than I would argue they have in the past. And this to me proves that we should be demanding more responsibility from them. So let me explain what I mean here. Content moderation, so deciding what is allowed to be said inside digital platforms, is always a values trade-off. It is a trade-off between my freedom to speak and the protection of people who could be harmed from that speech. And in some cases, those are irreconcilable trade-offs. You have to choose. Do you value speech, or do you value the protection of harms from speech? And every country in the democratic world comes at a different decision point on that trade-off. The United States falls aggressively on the freedom to speak side. Germany, for example, is much more aggressively on the freedom from harm of speech side for clear reasons, clear historical reasons. Canada's kind of somewhere in the middle, right? Our charter protections do protect us from harmful speech. We have limits of speech in Canada that we do not in the United States. So just to say, this is a spectrum. The challenge with platforms is they're trying to impose a global norm on everybody. And what we've seen up until now is because they are American companies and because they're embedded in the ideology of the internet, which prioritizes free speech, we've seen that as their core incentive structure towards free speech. Right now, we're seeing a very different thing play out. We are seeing mass pull downs of content that are deemed damaging. We're seeing the prioritization and the escalation of reliable speech coming from the WHO, for example, being circulated and amplified on these platforms. And this is a different position. They are coming to a different place on that spectrum. And I'm wondering if that's going to last. What does this say about their broader content moderation strategies, which are in active debate right now? So take, for example, the political ads issue that we've seen play out over the last few months. Facebook has said that they will allow politicians to lie. They will not fact check politicians inside their platform, because that should be us as citizens to decide and make a decision and evaluate that lie, right? That's our democratic role. Is that position going to hold through this? If politicians are using micro-targeted ads to lie about how people should behave in response to a pandemic, how are the companies going to come down on that? I don't think we know yet, and it's going to have a real impact. So on this content moderation issue, the Overton window, right? What is acceptable to be said and debated is shifting quickly. And I'm not sure it's going to shift back to where we were before. Final thing on the content moderation, there's a lot of dynamics going on right now. One of them is that companies have had to shut down a lot of their content moderation operations, right? So Facebook alone has 30,000 content moderators that sit in sort of large content moderation facilities. They see a piece of content every 7 seconds and they decide whether it should be kept up or pulled down, right? These people aren't working right now, which means that AI is taking on a lot more of the role of deciding what stays and what doesn't. And we're starting to see some broad repercussions of that, right? Because AI is a lot worse still than humans at doing this. So not just for pandemic information, but for content moderation writ large, for racist speech, for child exploitation, for terrorist content, all the things we pull down, or the platforms pull down, it's getting harder to do that because we don't have these teams of people doing it. So just kind of an offshoot repercussion of what's going on here. Fourth point I would make is that the problem of content moderation, so that problem I just described, reveals, as it always has, much bigger challenges in the design of this infrastructure and how we're going to govern it. I won't go into this in detail. I mean, this is a much bigger topic. But just to make the point that the problem of misinformation has never been about individual bad actors and which particular pieces of content we pull down. It has always been a structural problem. It's about how we've designed our digital infrastructure. And there's always been 3 key aspects of this design. One is how you manage massive scale. These companies have to deal with a massive amount of content. Facebook alone has 1 billion new pieces of content a day that they need to figure out how to distribute, manage what stays up, what stays down, what gets amplified, what doesn't, and who sees what. So that is one structural challenge. The role of automation and AI in this is a huge structural challenge. It is AI that determines what we see and whether we are seen and heard. And the way that AI is designed, in part to deal with the scale, has a huge impact on the nature of our public sphere. It is crafting it second to second. for billions of people, right? And the third structural challenge has always been the financial model. What we see, what we do, what voices get heard, what content gets seen is incentivized by a financial model. This financial model prioritizes certain types of content. It is content that is engaging to us that will make us spend more time on these platforms. This is a much bigger story that you all know. But right now, just keep in mind that the content we're seeing is still being driven by that algorithmic incentive. What will make us engage with it? What will make content go viral? What will make us spend more time on these websites is still the underlying incentive structure of the design of our public sphere. So we should think about whether that is what we want in this moment, right? If these are the real drivers of the disinformation we're seeing, about the quality of the information we're seeing, and we think that is a problem, a unique problem right now, then should we be asking companies to do more than just pull down bad pandemic information? Should we be asking them to adjust their algorithms, maybe to prioritize reliable information over engaging content? Should we be asking them to limit micro-targeting for certain types of content? Should I not be allowed to micro-target bad pandemic information to people? And then on the speech issue, do we really want these companies making these broad determinations about what is allowable speech in this moment? And is this maybe instead the time for democratic governments to engage with this conversation? They've been far too distant, in my view, in stepping into this space about allowable speech. In my view, it's the responsibility of democratic governments to make these determinations. And maybe now's the time they should start doing that. Okay, a few more quick points here. And this one follows on that. Fifth point, are we going to start seeing these platforms viewed as essential services? Part of the reason we've regulated our communication infrastructure, for the last 100 years, is because we've deemed it essential, an essential part of our society. And we've particularly deemed it essential in times of emergencies. So we've regulated the space, so in particular moments, we know that a certain character of our communications infrastructure will emerge and be possible. That may not be the case now because we've left this space so unregulated. It's pretty clear, though, that Amazon, for example, is emerging as an essential service. Amazon put out a call for 100,000 new employees the other day, right? Because they are a core piece of how society functions right now. We are getting our goods and services through this company and its infrastructure. Facebook is clearly becoming a broadcaster, right? Who is putting a broadcast message on the top of everybody's news feed, because that is the way you reach as many people as possible. It used to be TV in prime time. Now it's the top of people's Facebook feeds. So are they an essential service? Probably right now. Twitter is a telecom in many ways. We are seeing the messages of our political leaders being transmitted via the network of Twitter, right? So what is this broader view of this responsibility, both from the platform side, but also how governments view them and how we as society view their role? I think that is shifting. Sixth point, and this is a little bit off of the misinformation space, but it's something I'm frankly really worried about. I think policies we impose during a crisis can be really sticky. We heard from Chris in the last session what kind of remarkable policy moment we're in the fiscal space, right? We're talking about things we didn't talk about 2 weeks ago as if they're normal. And that is what crises do, right? They create spaces of normalcy around things that were outside of the bounds of our policy discourse before. I think we're seeing that with the movement of people too, right? The idea that we're talking about closing down provincial borders, right? That 2 weeks ago, that would have seemed outside of the bounds of possibility. And now it's a realistic thing. One space we're also seeing that is around surveillance technology and biometric surveillance in particular. This is something that I've been very worried about for a while, and we've been really ramping up our work on it. Particularly on facial recognition is where we've been shifting some of our work and we're planning on expanding already, because we are already seeing governments and corporations move into the rapid expansion of facial recognition technology. We are about to see a big discussion, I think, around biometric surveillance. Knowing an individual's temperature, for example, and where they are and who they've come into contact with is an incredibly powerful thing right now, and might prove very important to how we respond to this pandemic. The US government is in conversations with the platforms in how they might do this. The Israeli government has put in emergency measures for its security agencies to track the mobile phone data of people who have tested positive. But there is a broader space of this that is already under discussion. Companies, much more pernicious surveillance companies, like I would say Palantir and Clearview AI, which does large-scale facial recognition, are in discussions with government as we speak. I suspect they're in conversations with the Canadian government about how they might be able to help us track people in this moment. I see value to some of these technologies right now. I think we need to think carefully, though, about normalizing them. And in the longer term, how that might play out if this very powerful, and I would argue, illiberal technology embeds itself in our governance systems and is allowed in our legal and regulatory systems. So just something to keep an eye on as that conversation evolves. Seventh point, this goes in a bit of a different direction, but one of the things I'm thinking about is what kinds of information exposure leads to both positive and negative behavioral change. This is some of the work we've been doing around elections in our lab. We were looking, for example, in the Canadian election, at whether exposure to different types of misinformation and disinformation will lead to the changes in behavior in individuals during an election, in citizens. And what kind of signals, whether they be from elites, from authorities, from friends on Facebook, right, from journalists, lead to more or less behavioral change and positive or negative directions. And right now, that is a really critical question. So I don't have much to say on that right now. We are taking the methodology that we've applied during elections, and we're applying it right now over the next 6 months to information around this pandemic. We have a survey going in the field this week, and we'll have data on that coming in the next couple of weeks, which I'll share with everybody. Two more points, which are slightly broader. Eighth point I would broadly make is that we are, as we speak, establishing new social norms with technology. The idea of the digital divide, that we somehow had a digital life and a physical life and that those were different, was always kind of a false premise, right? We've always mediated our social, economic, and political interactions using technology, and that's a real thing, right? It's changed each of those. It's changed the way we socially, economically, and politically engage. It's a part of our lives, and it always has been, right? But now we're kind of running this massive experiment in what happens when much larger parts of each of those aspects of our lives, our social, our economic, and our political participation, moves on to a very particular set of technologies. Our social interactions. We're hearing a lot about all the ways that we can use these technologies to keep our social interactions in a time when we're physically distanced from each other. Our economy is being pushed into the digital space, both how we work, but also how literally our economy functions. What aspects of our economy can be digitized and which can't? We are seeing that right now, as we heard last week. And our politics is moving digitally. It could very well be that the American election plays out in a largely digital space. That is a pretty remarkable experiment. So if that is the case, I think we should be watching how that plays out for both positive and negative effects. A couple things I would point out. We are moving all of these aspects of our lives onto a certain set of technologies and platforms. And we know that how those platforms are designed and what incentives are embedded in them determines what kind of interactions happen on them, right? These are built things with incentives in them. And the platforms that we are moving on to are almost entirely large-scale, global, commercial platforms, meaning they are incentivized by the need for scale and the monetization of that scale. That is what they are, unabashedly, right? But what does it mean when we move all of our society onto these commercial platforms? And there's been a big movement lately to think about platforms as potentially public goods, right? So what would happen if you built these platforms in a way that were incentivized for different things, for positive social interaction, for reliable information, right? For other things other than that commercial motive, which is the core of them. And now might be a time we want to start thinking about that. What would a large public platform in which we move our society, as we're doing right now, look like that was designed with different incentives in it? And I think we're going to start hearing a lot, and I would sort of keep your ear tuned for this, around big public digital infrastructures. What do those look like? And a lot of people have been working on this, and I think the people who have are going to have very prominent voices in the next 6 months. The final point I would make, and then we can sort of have a broader conversation here, is what does this do to us when we move this discourse digital? And in particular to our mental health. And this is something I think we all need to be thinking carefully about. I'm personally a very, I would say, high Twitter user, right? It is the tool through which I get most of my information. And that creates a certain relationship with the news, relationship with the world. It is how much of my reality is mediated, right? To put it in those terms. And I think in the early phases of this, people who got a lot of their news and information through that medium tended to be fairly alarmist on this, because they saw minute to minute how it played out in other contexts, right? In a way that I think people who consumed their information largely through traditional journalism didn't see that, right? Because it wasn't prioritized in the same way in that infrastructure. But this, I think in this moment, you're seeing this with a lot of people, tons of information right now about this is causing real anxiety, because we are not built as humans necessarily to see every second a horrible thing that's happening somewhere in the world about this. And that is not our personal reality. That is the reality of all of these bad things that are being prioritized within this infrastructure, right? And that's like just something I think we need to think about. I personally turned off Twitter for a few days, and it did amazing things. And we can talk more about what it did, but it really changed my view on this situation. So online communities are a double-edged sword. We get a huge amount of benefit from it, a huge amount of social benefit, political benefit, economic benefit. But we also know from 20 years of experimentation with these technologies that the use of these tools also creates serious mental health challenges. So as we move all of this social interaction into these spaces, I think we need to be aware of that and be careful, right? Because I think we are going to start seeing some of those problems that we know exist in kids who use high rates of social media, in general users of Facebook and Twitter who have certain types of mental health repercussions. We need to be thinking about that collectively.